So why fire? Why do this workshop? Why is this wildlife guy doing a fire workshop? And it really comes down to, I thought this was a really great kind of unifying opening concept that a lot of you might have learned about in your, high school, middle school, elementary school, even science class. This is called the energy pyramid, also called the trophic pyramid. And when you talk about trophic, it's like a fancy word academics like to use. All it means is nutrition. Trophic means nutrition, and it's about food. And the whole thing is it's based on the producers, which are your vegetation. And we have our primary consumers. They're the ones that are our herbivores. They're eating grasses and other types of vegetation. And then you have your secondary consumers, your predators, your first level predators, and your secondary level predators at the top of the food chain. But the big thing is everything depends. All this wildlife is based on your vegetation. So I'm a wildlife management guy, but I'm really a plant guy because everything relies on the plants. And this model this is called the model of succession. Many of you have probably seen, I know Rick even knows all about succession, but the idea behind succession, Clements came up with this out of the University of Nebraska, I think in 1916. An American ecologist came up with the concept of succession. It doesn't work everywhere, especially doesn't work as much in the West. Those are in desert environments. It's much more driven by weather and like random abiotic factors. Here on the East, where we have pretty wet conditions, tends to follow this pattern of succession, where over time, if you have fire or you have a field that's been farmed for many years, or you just mow it down to the ground every year, or disc it or plow it, whatever you have, and you let that alone, over the course of a couple of years, you'll have grass fields like we burned today. That was 1 year after farming. That's 1 full year of grass growth. And we already have some little saplings coming out in these fields. You may have seen some. Next year, those saplings are going to be about this tall. Next year after that, they're probably going to be 10 feet tall. So this happens very quickly on these wet environments. And soon you end up with shrubs. We have a spot over on the Y Angus where we put in habitat, and we have baccharis, which is called high tide bush is the common name. And the trunk of the high tide bush at 3 years is probably about 3 inches at the base. So it happens fast. So you get a lot of these shrubs coming in here, and then over time you end up succeeding into a mature forest. Several different species move through this forest, and we'll talk about why fire. But you see fire here on the left. It's one of these actions that can reset this whole process from a mature or anywhere in this process. It can knock it back and start it all over again.
Right.
It can be fire. Disease does this. Emerald ash borer cleared huge areas of forest in my backyard. Our wetland is now an open grassland mostly. Some maples are left behind. Logging will do this. Timber harvests, plowing, mowing, grazing. We had a lot of grazing animals here even before pre-colonial times. We had bison, elk. Before, and then we had humans here. Humans here until about 12,000 years ago, and they were burning fires. And before that, we had megafauna. We had giant sloths and mammoths and other big things that were definitely grazing a bunch of this stuff down and creating a very different kind of environment, like vegetation environment on the landscape. So fire, and what could it have come from? Is this natural? Obviously, this is what we just did is not natural. We had a bunch of people out here putting fire on the ground. But historically, you had lightning strikes. There was nobody who put these things out. I mentioned a little bit, this is John Smith with the Powhatan people. Native Americans were known to burn a lot on the landscape to drive game, or even just to create more open habitats where deer and elk would have grazed more. And researchers have looked at fire at tree rings. So you can look at tree rings and you put them under a microscope and you can see old fires contained in the tree rings. You can see charcoal lines on these tree rings. So they go to these old trees that are 500 years old, 400 years old, and they count back 300 years ago, and they're like, oh, there was a fire here 300 years ago. And then this researchers, Guyette et al. Back in 2012 did this nationwide estimate using tree rings and whatever other data they could find. I believe this is mostly tree ring data, to come up with estimates for how often were fires happening across the United States. And this dark red color is fires that were less than every 2 years. on average, you would have a fire every 2 years, less than every 2 years. The slightly lighter orange, 2 to 4 years, 4 to 6, and this kind of lighter orange, and it moves on as you get to this blue. Is very rare. Just wasn't a lot of vegetation in these deserts. But most of Maryland is between 4 to 12 years between fire intervals. And that, as you get up to more of the mountainous areas, it was longer periods of time between you would have fires. So out here on the coastal plain, we are in a pretty heavy orange color. That's 2 to 6 years or so. And so we just saw, you might have noticed when you're out there, you have these patches. This is a fire I was on in California. And you can see the black here that burned, and you have these areas that are green. And you might have seen out there, there's some little patches that are green still. There's some areas that aren't burning fully and completely. Here's another example. This one burned a little bit more fully, but you have these little wet areas. This has a lot of topography and wet spots. You have these spots that just aren't burning. And what that helps to create, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is it helps to create a diverse vegetation structure. So if you have fires on the landscape at one year, and you start piling this up over multiple years, this is a great illustration from Phil and Crandall, 2012. And they talked about over time, as you burn multiple years, you end up getting areas that burn a little hotter certain years and don't burn other years. So if you burn that same field, you end up with this mosaic. Some of these spots burned all 4 times. Some of them only burned 1 time. So you ended up creating a huge type of diversity and mosaic in your grassland from burning an area over and over, just from natural variation of how the fire is going to move across the landscape. And what does that do? Why do we care about that for wildlife? It creates what I call macro structure. We all learn about wildlife habitat as food, water, space, and arrangement. That's sort of the standard, first grade, this is what habitat is. But I think maybe more importantly is the structure, because a lot of species need sort of certain arrangements of trees or grasslands.
Right.
So there's a lot of ways in which your trees can be spaced. And here's another model of succession where it illustrates there's different types of birds, for example, that will key in on certain types of habitat, certain types of forests.
Well, they're faint.
So there's that big picture structure, and you have microstructure at very small scales. So if you zoom in and see what's happening about a week or 2 after the burn, this is out at Turner Creek Farm, and you see this regrowth of plants coming out of that area. So a couple of things happen at the micro level, at the grassland level. You have this ash increases nutrient availability. It's not a huge fertilization effect, but there's a slight fertilization effect. Increases the pH, which is oftentimes we have acidic soils here. Increased pH also makes nutrients more available. So there's sort of fertilization through pH. It takes all that thatch away, and your sunlight is being able to hit the ground. And your seeds are also, certain seeds are going to respond to be able to have direct sunlight on the seed as it's growing. And it creates something right here that has kind of been a bad word for a long time in ecology and natural resources is bare ground. A lot of us we've been working real hard to avoid bare ground. I work with NRCS, and that's kind of like the thing you always don't want to have is bare ground. If you go look, I was researching quail habitat correlates through several papers, and they go through and they're measuring all the different plants in a field, and they're saying, okay, what's the biggest driver for correlation for having quail? As bare ground. Quail like to have bare ground. If you've ever noticed, we don't have many quail around, but you can notice this with mourning doves. They always like to fly down onto your roadside and the dirt patches, and they're pecking at that gravel for their crops. They also can see seeds, and quail are a ground nesting bird. They're a ground dwelling bird for the most part, and they're pecking around. They need to be able to move around and find seeds, find insects. So this helps with their navigation on the ground.
And 75% of native bees require bare ground.
Oh, that's awesome to know. So I just learned 75% of native bees require bare ground as well. I did not know that about arthropods. So there's some other benefits to, maybe some things have happened where we always go kind of like maybe too far with stuff and like try and create a one size fits all approach. And it's like, oh, turns out we might need some bare ground for a lot of things. Yeah. So here's another example of, so we have this diverse, that's another successional stage. You have, this is a great illustration I picked up from Nicole Fuller, where it illustrates the different birds, and birds are one of a lot of different wildlife species, but they're great because they're as an indicator, because they can move over vast distances and they respond really quickly to habitat and structure changes. So you have grasshopper sparrows, which we have out here, eastern meadowlarks, field sparrows, and as you move across this, you start moving into more woodland birds, red-eyed vireos, wood thrushes, black and white warblers. This is that same process. So you have that diversity of species. So to get all of these species, you need all of these different structural components, right? So if you only have these mature ones, you're not going to have any of these. And you can go even smaller, right? There's this great paper from MacArthur in 1958. This is like it's called resource partitioning, but basically niche theory. This idea that all these different warblers are picking, they're so focused in on habitat that they're focusing on certain parts of a spruce tree that they prefer to live in. These are 5 different species of warblers that will narrow in on particular parts of a spruce tree. And MacArthur found this out in 1958 and wrote all about it. It's a pretty famous example. But it's just to point out how subtle differences in resource use can carve out different niches for these different birds. And it allows multiple species to thrive in the same habitat. So that's kind of the big takeaway. And what I'm setting us up here for is a call for what we're trying to do is increase that diversity on the landscape. Here in Maryland, this is Chesapeake Conservancy data. About 43% of our landscape is forest, about 18% cropland, 13% turf grass, 12% developed. Then we started to get into something that's akin to grassland and open habitat, pasture and hay, which oftentimes is not great habitat. It's usually exotic grasses, and hay can be really rough on our birds. If you do hay farming, come talk to me. There's a lot of good things you can do to improve hay management for wildlife. And then we have natural succession down here at 2.1% of our landscape. So we have a very heavily forested landscape. And the ages of our forests, this is something I learned from Matt Hurd. Where's Matt at? He's probably out in the back talking with somebody. Is our forests tend to be between 60 to 100 years old. The majority of our forests, they were cleared about 60 to 100 years ago, and they've all regenerated, and they're relatively even aged forests across a lot of our landscape. Doesn't hold for everything. We do have some young forests, but a lot of it, we have this bulk of forest that's all this age. And this is kind of what I think we've sort of come to think about as wildlife habitat or conservation in Maryland. This is a Patuxent National Wildlife Refuge. And I look at this as a quail guy, and I'm thinking, man, that power line, that transmission line is the best grassland habitat they got on that place, which is a little funny, right? It's like, huh. They don't burn it. They don't burn. It's hard to burn it. I was talking to somebody that said they're having a hard time putting fire lines in because it's soil disturbance. So it makes it hard to create that early successional habitat. It's an area in Charles County. Again, just these vast areas of forest, which are good for certain woodland birds. I like forest. I live in the forest too. But we've had what a lot of our understory forest ends up looking like is something like this. This is actually here on this farm. This is what our woods looks like. And this is winter, but it's not much better in the summer. There's hardly anything on the understory. You can walk right through there. You don't have to worry about getting ticks. You're not going to be brushing your pants up in any vegetation. It's just closed canopy, high density forest. And that is tough for anything that is below 5 feet. There's no groceries in the grocery store. If you're a ground nesting bird, you're a turkey, you're a quail, you don't have any cover from predators. You're sort of exposed. Here's an example of an area that was timbered probably about 15 years ago and has a very strong, heavy understory example. Just to show you, just give you a visual picture of, it's a very different type of forest for wildlife than what we have here. And then there's other even rarer types of forests. This is hard to find in Maryland, but this is managed very specifically for quail to have this savanna habitat. This is John Long's place down in near Nanticoke. Very, very unique. And a lot of folks say this is what some settler accounts say our woodlands might have looked like back in the past. I like to say we don't really know. Like, we can all try and guess what things were like. We don't really know. We don't have pictures. We don't have satellite imagery from 1492. but we have some journal accounts. And then also, I think we kind of get to a point of like, well, what do we want on the landscape? And a lot of people want biodiversity. They want a diversity of species to maximize all the different types of life on the landscape. Another type of habitat we also see very rarely, this is Nanticoke Wildlife Management Area, one of the few places you can see wild quail in Maryland. They're hanging on there thanks to Bob Long's efforts, and a lot of these guys, Gilbert, I know he's out there burning a lot. Greg Shank, if he's listening, he's probably over there talking. Greg does a lot of work out there. Great work. They burn this a lot, and they keep this open. One of the last places you can find quail. And you also see, picture isn't coming in great, but this is Idlewild State Forest. You don't see a lot of these large scale cuts. There's there's trees that were left behind, seed tree that were left behind, creating a savanna in this area. So again, more kind of pro quail work, but it's relatively rare. You see a lot more of this type of satellite imagery in a lot of areas, especially Southern Maryland's a lot like this. Or you see a lot of cropland, or you see this and cropland and developed land, but you don't have a lot of this, you don't have a lot of this, you don't have a lot of that. These are pretty rare. You have to kind of go look for this. And so what has that led to with our wildlife? Our population trends, if you look at the breeding bird survey data, this is from 1966 to 2022, and you categorize them into guilds of species of birds. So this is multiple birds that like grasslands, successional, wetlands, and woodlands. If it's red, there's a percentage of species in that grassland, in that category, that has seen significant declines since 1966. If it's green, it's had some increases. This is a percentage of all the species in that group. And you can see real quick, like grasslands majority of our grassland birds are kind of tanking. They're not doing well. Successional and scrub species, which is where quail probably land a little bit more than grassland. They're more of a shrub obligate species. They need that cover to hide from hawks. They're not doing good. Our wetland species are about a little bit more losses on the percentage, but you've had about a bunch. Gray is non-significant, and you've had a lot that have increased. And in our woodlands, we've had more increase than we have had decrease. Now there's ways you question this data. There's a lot of different ways that the data can be parsed. You could say, well, you're starting, and I just like to share this because I don't want anybody to pull one over on me. But some people say, well, that's 1966. That was coming out of a period of a lot of clearing. You had it was sort of an artificial baseline of more grassland on the landscape than we have now. So maybe all these sort of changes are not fair. Maybe so. I argue a lot with Ken Staver. He's my colleague at the Y, and he thinks this was all forest back in the day. I think there probably were quail here. There were lightning strikes and other things. But the thing is, we'll never know. We can argue about it a lot. There's some data, but not a lot of great data. But one thing I do know is that grassland birds have tanked. Quail used to be here, and now they're extirpated from vast parts of Maryland, as well as a lot of other birds are not doing well. So 9 of the top 10 declining birds in Maryland need early successional or grassland habitat. So this is a prairie warbler right here. Bobwhite quail are number 1 declining bird in the state. We've got a guide. You have a guide in your booklet. I published this last summer. It goes through a lot of different ways you can manage for them. Prairie warblers have declined, top 10 declining bird. Eastern meadowlarks, beautiful call in the morning. They've declined. Barn owls, they're not on that list. They weren't one of those species tracked, but they're not doing great. There's only a couple pairs left in all of the Patuxent River area. They need open fields that they forage in. They're looking for voles, and they've declined a lot. Grasshopper sparrows, they nest in the grasslands and forage in the grasslands. I think they're number 2 in our list. So how does fire, so that sort of sets the stage of, okay, we're here for fire. So how does fire do all this? I set the stage a little bit of that earlier, but there's 3 main considerations to think about when you're going to put fire on the ground, and think about that for wildlife. 1, how often do you do it? We call that frequency. So how often is that fire coming through? Is it every year, every 2 years, every 3 years, or longer? 2, how big are those fires? We just burned about 20 acres, maybe combined everything, maybe it's 25 acres. What's the scale at which you're doing this at? And then when do you do it? What's your season? What time of year are you burning? So we'll cover each of these, and then I'll wrap it up. So how often do you burn? that will do a lot to set up what kind of vegetation structure you have. Here on the left, this is burned every 1 to 2 years. I want to say thanks to Kyle Magic for this slide and these great pictures. It keeps a very open grassland type of habitat. This area is burned every 3 to 6 years. So you can see those saplings, 3 to 6 years, you'll get these saplings and young trees in here. And it gets to be a point where it gets to be hard to burn and then get fire to carry through some of this. And this is a woodland where it's burned every 7+ years. So you can actually carry fire in the pine needles underneath a woodland setting. And a lot of these trees are adapted with bark to survive low-level fires. Some of the species that don't do well with fire are beeches and maples. Those will tend to blink out. You'll have more oaks and hardwoods, as well as pines can survive these fires a bit better. So that's a sort of frequency. So if you're aiming for certain structures in your habitat, this is a way in which you can think about managing for that structure that's going to bring particular species. So how big do we do? This is our idealized map of what we want to do. Here, we're here at this barn, and we've done this sort of patchwork checkerboard pattern, and the idea is every other year we're going to try and burn fields. This is going to get modified for sure, but this is an idealized version to think about. So you can burn, these are all, say, 10 to 20 acre fields, or you can start thinking about the scale of like, oh, what if you flip it like this, where you just burn this whole section of farm all at once? And so you're just talking about maybe you're doing like 100 acres all in one big area versus a lot of little patchwork of 20 acres. So how does that affect wildlife? This is a great paper. Also got put onto this from Kyle Cohen et al. He worked with Mike Chamberlain, who's he's a famous turkey biologist, I would say. He's the last author. He's a senior author on this paper, so he's really the brains behind it. But that's what happens when you're in peer review papers. The last person's name on there is usually the guy running the show. The distance to the unburned stand. So they've tracked turkeys, and they found like as you got further and further away from unburned areas, so that's like deeper into burned areas, right? So if you go 200 meters, 400 meters into a burned area, if it's a really large area, the turkeys aren't using it as much. They need to escape to their unburned areas and have cover. They like to go into them, and they really like to go into them, especially when they're close to the unburned areas. But if it's 400 meters away, their use drops by half or more. And it goes to 500-600 meters away, they're not going there at all. They need more cover. So that patchy type of burn structure is good for a lot of these birds because they can move into an existing field with some cover and into a freshly burned field to forage for seeds and insects. So that's scale. Then the last piece is season. When do you want to burn? And right now we're here at the end of March. Here in Maryland, most of our fire, I think most people recommend doing it in the spring. Before April 15th is kind of our cutoff mark. For federal programs, April 15th is the date. What happens on April 15th?
Magic.
Taxes. God, I hadn't thought about that.
I'm not your CPA.
We got CPA here. Birds start showing up and they start putting their nests into our fields. So kind of staying to torch a bird nest, right? And if you do any haying or you know anybody who does hay fields, a lot of nests get wrapped up in that first cut of hay. So there's some things you can do to manage for that. I think that's probably one of the biggest things that have been like blowing my mind. We got a paper coming out on that later, but that April 15th time is kind of getting before the nesting season for a lot of birds. Now, you can still burn in the summer, and a lot of guys are saying if you need to there are a lot of benefits for improving the structure, even if you might be losing some nests. And they've looked at this with turkeys, for example. They're burning in the middle of the growing season. They know there's turkey nests there. They know they torched one, but they find on a whole, the population is benefiting from having some of this setback vegetation, even though you might lose a few nests. Now, but generally it's nice to kind of avoid it if you can get your structure elsewhere. And then you could burn in the fall too. This helps kill trees a bit better because I mentioned this earlier, they're putting all their carbohydrate reserves back into their roots for the winter. And so by burning them before they do that and you interrupt that process, it puts more stress on that sapling. Might not kill it all the way, might have a better kill rate. Kind of depends on a lot of factors. So you can do that to kill saplings. One thing you leave though, if you do it too late, is you have a sort of barren area over all winter, so there's no cover. So cover is a really important thing in winter. Think of snow, and it's like I tell everybody, it's like a warm blanket for wildlife over winter. So this also goes for mowing. If you're going to mow, just hold your mowing off till February, March, and then all those rabbits and everything else, they can hide out in that grassland during the winter. So consider, and also not only warmth but predator protection. So your mice and other things can hide in that grassland over winter. Active nesting seasons and non-target species. And I'll go through some slides from Tammy Ransom from our workshop last year. This is actually from Ernst, Lovich, and Barbour. They looked at a lot of different species, and like these are other things to think about, like salamanders, lizards, turtles. How are they affected? Salamanders, if you have some tiger salamanders and you're really managing for that, it seems as though they are active already. So certain salamander species, if you're looking for them, they might be active pretty early. Most of them aren't coming in until April, or a lot of them aren't. A lot of them are in wetland areas that aren't going to burn. So, but it's something to think about for salamanders. Lizards are pretty safe. Again, that April 15th date, you're pretty safe. Things are starting to get used in late April. So it's pretty safe for lizards up until then. Turtles, the same thing. As you move out into April, you start to get a lot of turtle species that are becoming more active again. Slide from Tammy Ransom, and this works from Ernst, Lovich, and Barbour. Out of the Jug Bay Wetland Sanctuaries. This is our local Maryland data. Really cool. Right by you. Nice. So takeaway. So the non-target species are also a consideration for burning in spring. So big takeaways, what this whole thing's all about. I was trying to wrap this whole thing up. Animals depend on plants. Plant structure depends on disturbance. So getting structure is, we need some sort of disturbance on the landscape to get diversity of structure. To have diverse animals, you need diverse habitat. Fire creates a lot of diversity. It's one of the tools in the toolbox to create diversity. You also got disking, other types of farming, logging to create that diversity. But fire is one of the tools in the toolbox. Much of our landscape, I feel we're oftentimes lacking a lot of diversity, especially our grassland shrubland specialists. They've been hit hardest. And there's three ways you can use fire. Big takeaway things. One, how often are you going to do it? If you're managing for quail, it's going to be every other year, maybe every 3 years. If you're managing for other species, you can go longer. How big? What's the scale? Generally, smaller is better because you can have kind of more broken up stuff. And then when, ideally doing it in spring, but you can do it afterwards. Sometimes the structural characteristics you're creating from burning, you might lose some individuals, but the population as a whole is going to actually benefit. So that's my big takeaway. It's my email. You've probably already gotten emails from me. Feel free to hit me up there. It's my cell phone if you ever need to reach me for anything. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to having Shannon next.